The auditorium was packed. The murmur of voices echoed between the rows of chairs, and on stage, Professor Richard Carter, a man with graying hair and thin-rimmed glasses, watched the crowd with a calm yet attentive gaze. He had never been fond of goodbyes, but there was something special about that night. It was his students' graduation. For him, every ceremony was a reminder of why he had chosen to teach. But he had no idea that, on that night, his life would change forever. Richard had always believed in the power of education. He didn't see students as just numbers on a spreadsheet. To him, they were stories in the making. And years ago, he had done something that changed one of those stories forever. Back then, a young man named Ethan Parker was on the verge of giving up everything. He was brilliant, hardworking, but life had never been easy for him. Working late nights at a restaurant to pay the bills and studying all day, he was on the brink of collapse. The final hurdle? The graduation fee. For Ethan, at that moment, the amount was impossible. And that's when Professor Richard Carter stepped in. Without hesitation, Richard paid the young man's graduation fee out of his own pocket, expecting nothing in return. A simple "thank you" was enough. Or at least, that's what he thought. That graduation night, years later, as Richard applauded his students and prepared to say goodbye to another class, something happened. A name was announced on stage, a name he knew all too well. And then, he heard the words that made his heart stop for a moment. "Professor Carter, now it's my turn to give back for what you did for me. Before I continue this story, if you believe that a simple act of kindness can change a life forever, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And tell me in the comments, have you ever received or done an act of kindness that you'll never forget?" Ethan Parker had never had an easy life. Since childhood, he had learned that the world wasn't generous to those who had little. He grew up in a modest neighborhood, raised by a single mother who did everything she could to put food on the table. Money was always tight, and dreams often had to be set aside to make room for more urgent needs. But Ethan was different. He refused to believe that his circumstances would define his future. From an early age, he decided that the only way out of his situation was through education. He wasn't just a dedicated student. He was a fighter, someone who battled against every obstacle to earn his place in the world. The nights were long. He worked until the early hours of the morning washing dishes in a small corner restaurant, his hands always red from constant contact with hot water and soap. The few minutes of rest he had were spent reviewing notes hastily scribbled on scraps of paper. Morning started early, with barely any sleep, and there he was, sitting in the front row of the classroom, absorbing every word spoken by Professor Richard Carter. Professor Carter quickly noticed there was something special about that boy. Dedicated, intelligent, but carrying a weight on his shoulders that few in that classroom could understand. Richard saw Ethan's tired eyes, the small, stifled yawns during lectures, the way he always avoided talking about his personal life. But it wasn't until the last semester, when graduation was approaching, that Ethan finally let his guard down. It was a cold November afternoon. The campus was draped in shades of orange and red, dry leaves scattered across the grass. Ethan sat on a wooden bench, head down, staring at a form he held in his trembling hands. Professor Carter saw him from a distance and immediately sensed something was wrong. He approached slowly and sat beside him. "Looks like there's a storm brewing in that head of yours, Parker," Carter said in his usual calm, fatherly tone. Ethan forced a smile, but he couldn't hide the distress in his eyes. "Professor, He took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to say the words he dreaded. "I don't think I can graduate." Carter frowned. "What do you mean? You're one of the best students in the class. Your grades are all in order. What's going on?" Ethan looked at the form in his hands. "It's the graduation fee. I don't have the money. I tried saving up, but between rent, food, and my mom's bills, I just can't make it work." The professor was silent for a moment, analyzing the situation. He knew how hard Ethan had worked to get there. It wasn't fair for a bureaucratic detail to destroy everything he had accomplished. So, without a second thought, Richard Carter made a decision that would change that young man's life forever. "How much is the fee?" he asked, his voice firm but gentle. "Enough to make me give up," Ethan murmured, looking away. Carter sighed. He had already made up his mind. Listen to me, Parker. You are not giving up. You've worked way too hard to get here. So tomorrow, you're going to the office, handing in that form, and telling them everything's taken care of. Ethan's eyes widened. What? But don't worry about it, Carter said with a small smile. Just do what you need to do. Ethan was speechless. A lump formed in his throat. He wanted to refuse, to say he couldn't accept it. But when he looked into his professor's eyes, he saw something unexpected. Faith in him. Professor, I don't know how to thank you. One day, you'll find your own way to pay it forward. But for now, just go and finish what you started. And with that, their fates were sealed forever. Graduation day arrived faster than Ethan had imagined. The university auditorium was decorated with blue and gold banners, and the excitement in the air was almost tangible. This was the day he had dreamed of for so long. The diploma that once felt like an impossible goal was now just a few steps away. Wearing his black graduation gown and holding his cap between his fingers, Ethan scanned the crowd of students and families, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. He had made it, but he knew he wouldn't be standing there without the unexpected help of a man who believed in him when no one else did. On the other side of the hall, Professor Richard Carter sat among the other faculty members, watching the graduates with a quiet smile. He wasn't expecting recognition or public thanks. To him, this was just another group of talented students heading out into the world. But deep down, he knew there was something special about this ceremony. As Ethan walked across the stage to receive his diploma, his heart pounded. He wanted to say something, to thank the professor right then and there in front of everyone. But for some reason, he decided to save those words for another moment. As he stepped off the stage, he caught Carter's gaze and gave him a subtle nod, a respectful gesture, heavy with meaning. Carter returned it with a small smile and a slight nod of his own. No words were needed. They both understood the weight of that moment. After the ceremony, while the students celebrated and took pictures, Ethan searched for the professor. He found him alone, organizing some papers near the stage. "Professor Carter," he called. Carter looked up and smiled when he saw him. "Well, Mr. Parker, looks like you did it." Ethan gripped his diploma tightly. "I only made it because of you. I don't know how to thank you." The professor shook his head, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me one thing." Ethan frowned. "What is it?" "That one day, when you're in the right place and you can, you'll do for someone else what I did for you." The professor's words echoed in Ethan's mind. It was more than just a favor. It was a cycle. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the promise he had just made. "I promise." With one last handshake, they said their goodbyes. Richard Carter didn't know if or when he would see Ethan Parker again. But somehow, he knew that kid was destined for something great. And he was right. What Ethan didn't realize was that years later, that promise would come full circle and change Carter's life in a way he never could have predicted. Time passed in the blink of an eye. The years had turned that determined young student into a respected professional, but the scars of his struggle never left Ethan Parker. He had kept his promise to himself, to succeed despite all the hardships. Now, Ethan was a successful entrepreneur, the owner of a rapidly growing tech company. His office was at the top of one of the tallest buildings in the city, one of the most modern buildings in the city, with glass windows offering a panoramic view of the urban skyline. It was a stark contrast to the young man who once washed dishes just to survive. But despite his success, he never forgot where he came from. And he never forgot Professor Richard Carter. It was just another ordinary day when Ethan, in the middle of back-to-back meetings and an endless stream of emails, received a message that made his world stop for a moment. An old college friend had sent him a text. "Ethan, I don't know if you've heard, but Professor Carter retired a few months ago. He's been going through some tough times. I thought you'd want to know." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. Tough times? He immediately started looking for more information. What he discovered left him shaken. Carter, now retired, was living on a modest pension that barely covered his medical expenses and rent. The man who had dedicated his life to helping others was now struggling, alone. That wasn't right. This couldn't be how things ended. Ethan knew it was his turn to act. He grabbed his phone and made a few calls. He had a plan that would change Professor Carter's life the same way, years ago, that man had changed his. Fate was about to come full circle. The sun was setting when Richard Carter arrived home, carrying a small bag of groceries. Retirement wasn't what he had imagined. After dedicating his entire life to teaching, he now faced a harsh reality. Bills were piling up, and his pension money seemed to vanish before the month was over. Sighing, he placed his keys on the table and sank into the old armchair in his living room, gazing around. The place that once felt cozy now seemed empty. Old photos of his students still lined the shelves, reminding him of the days when he was called the best professor at the university. But now he felt forgotten. That's when the phone rang. He hesitated for a moment before picking up. "Hello?" A familiar voice came through the line. "Professor Carter, it's been a long time." Richard frowned. That voice, he knew it. "Ethan." "Yeah, it's me. How are you?" Richard smiled, surprised. It had been years since he had spoken to that student. "Oh, I'm doing well. Just taking life as it comes," he said, trying to sound upbeat. Ethan could hear the fatigue in his voice. "Professor, I'd really like to see you. Do you have some free time tomorrow?" Carter found the request strange but nodded. "Of course, Ethan. Where?" "Meet me at the university. There's something I want to show you." The call ended, leaving Richard puzzled. Why, after all these years, did Ethan Parker want to see him? The next day, Carter put on his old blazer and walked toward the university. It felt different without him there. The building where he had taught for so many years looked the same, but he felt like a stranger in its halls. As he entered the auditorium, the same one where so many graduation ceremonies had taken place, including Ethan's years ago, he was met with a sight that left him speechless. A large banner hung across the stage. Professor Richard Carter, a tribute to a lifetime of dedication. The auditorium was packed, but it wasn't filled with students. It was filled with former students, people he had taught over the decades, all gathered there, waiting for him. And at the center of the stage stood Ethan Parker, holding an envelope. Richard's heart pounded. What was happening? He had no idea, but he was about to experience one of the most emotional moments of his life. Standing at the entrance of the auditorium, Richard Carter felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this. The professor who had spent years shaping young minds was now standing before those same minds, reunited for something he had never imagined receiving: recognition. Carter's eyes scanned the auditorium. Familiar faces emerged from the crowd. Young men and women who had once been just students were now successful professionals, lawyers, engineers, doctors, teachers. All of them were there for him. At the center of the stage, Ethan Parker held a microphone, his eyes shining with emotion. "Professor Carter." His voice was steady, yet full of feeling. "You always taught us that education can change the world. But I believe that some people change the world more than knowledge ever could." The auditorium fell silent. Everyone was listening, waiting for what would come next. "Years ago, you did something for me that changed my life forever," Ethan continued. "When I had lost hope, when everything seemed lost, you helped me without expecting anything in return. And that act of kindness echoed in every decision I've made since." The professor felt his eyes well up. He remembered that day. The graduation fee. That small gesture that, to him, had seemed insignificant, but had meant everything to Ethan. "I made a promise, Professor. I promised that one day I would give back. And today, that day has come." Ethan held up the envelope in his hand and looked directly at Richard Carter. "That's why, in the name of all the students who had the honor of learning from you, and with the help of many people in this room today, we organized something special." He paused. The moment was profound. "Professor Carter, we paid off your mortgage. Your house is now yours, free and clear, forever." A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. Carter stood frozen. Shock spread across his face, and his tear-filled eyes darted around as if searching for something solid to hold on to. "No, this can't be," he murmured, his voice breaking. But Ethan just smiled. "Yes, it can, Professor, because you taught us more than books ever could. You taught us about generosity. And now, it's our turn to give back." The silence shattered as the entire auditorium erupted into applause. Some former students were in tears, others smiling with overwhelming emotion. They were all there, celebrating the life of a man who never sought recognition but was now receiving the greatest gift he could imagine: gratitude. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Carter realized that he had not been forgotten. He raised a trembling hand to his face, trying to contain the flood of emotions washing over him. He had never expected this. He had spent his entire life teaching, believing his purpose was to prepare his students for the world. But at that moment, he understood that he had left a much deeper mark than he had ever imagined. The auditorium remained silent for a moment. It was as if everyone was waiting for his reaction. The man who always had the right words to guide his students now found himself speechless. He looked at Ethan, then at the faces surrounding him. Many of them he remembered well, young people who had entered his classroom full of doubts, who had grown, learned, failed, and succeeded. And now they were here, giving back what they had received from him. Carter tried to speak, but his voice failed him. His vision blurred with the tears that refused to be held back. He hadn't cried in years. Ethan stepped down from the stage and walked toward him. Without hesitation, he opened his arms and embraced the professor. "Thank you for everything, Professor." Ethan's voice was steady but filled with emotion. Carter returned the embrace, feeling the gratitude in every clap, in every tear-filled gaze. After a few moments, he took a deep breath and finally managed to speak. I don't know what to say." Ethan smiled. "You don't have to say anything, Professor. Just accept it. You did so much for us. Now it's our turn." The auditorium erupted into another round of applause, and Carter felt as if a new chapter of his life had begun right there. The tribute didn't end there. Several former students took the stage to share stories about how the professor had impacted their lives. Stories of moments when he had made a difference, advice that had changed destinies, encouragement that had given strength to those on the verge of giving up. Richard Carter realized that his legacy wasn't in the books he had taught. It was in the lives he had transformed. And on that day, he was truly celebrated. After the tribute, Richard Carter found himself surrounded by former students, colleagues, and even university staff. Each one wanted to personally express their gratitude. To him, it all felt surreal. He had spent decades teaching, never expecting anything in return, and now he saw that his impact had gone far beyond what he had ever imagined. Ethan stayed close, watching each emotional reunion. He knew that this moment wasn't just about repaying a debt of gratitude. It was about recognizing the true value of a teacher. "Professor Carter, you were like a father to me," said a woman with short hair and a determined gaze. "If I'm a lawyer today, it's because, when I was ready to give up, your words made me keep going. You always said there were no foolish questions, only opportunities to learn," another former student added. "That made me pursue a career in teaching. And today, I try to inspire my students the way you inspired me." Each story was another piece of Richard Carter's legacy. Retired or not, he remained alive in the hearts and careers of every person in that room. Then, Ethan called for silence. He had one more surprise. "Professor, in addition to paying off your house, we also created a scholarship fund in your name." Richard's eyes widened. "What?" "Yes," Ethan smiled. "From now on, every year, students facing financial hardships will have the chance to study with a full scholarship called the Professor Richard Carter Scholarship." The auditorium erupted into applause once again. Richard Carter could hardly believe it. He hadn't just received recognition. His name would live on for generations. Tears streamed down his face once more. He had never sought fame, never wanted rewards, but in that moment, he knew that his work would never be forgotten. The professor hugged Ethan again, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. That night, as he walked home, his home, truly his now, Carter looked up at the starry sky and smiled. His legacy was just beginning. The days that followed were unlike anything Richard Carter had ever experienced. Before, he had felt forgotten, a retired teacher struggling with the challenges of life. Now, he found himself surrounded by warmth, recognition, and a renewed sense of purpose. News of the tribute spread quickly. Local newspapers, academic blogs, and even television programs covered the story of the professor who had dedicated his life to teaching and, years later, was surprised by his former students. Richard began receiving letters and messages from students who hadn't been able to attend the tribute but still wanted to express their gratitude. Each word reminded him that his journey as a teacher had never been in vain. But the greatest change came within his own heart and mind. He no longer felt like a lonely man facing retirement. Instead, he saw his name echoing into the future, in every student who would receive the scholarship that Ethan and his colleagues had created. One day, while sipping coffee on his porch, his home, finally his, without debt, without worries, he received an unexpected phone call. "Professor Carter?" The voice on the other end was firm but carried a tone of respect. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Jonathan Miller. I'm the dean of a university here in New York. I came across your story and was deeply moved. I'd like to invite you to give a lecture at our institution." Carter smiled. It had been a long time since he had imagined himself on a stage, teaching. "I believe our students would love to learn from a professor like you," the dean continued. Richard gazed toward the horizon. The thought of returning to teaching, even in a different way, made his heart stir with excitement. "It would be an honor," he replied, his eyes shining. Life was offering him a new beginning. Months after the tribute, Richard Carter once again stepped onto the stage of a packed auditorium. This time, not as a university professor, but as a special guest, a living symbol of the impact that education and generosity can have on the world. The university dean introduced him with enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have among us a man whose legacy extends far beyond the classroom. A teacher who, through small acts of kindness, has transformed lives, and who today receives the recognition he has always deserved. Please welcome Professor Richard Carter." The audience rose to their feet, applauding. Carter felt a shiver run down his spine. He had never sought recognition, never imagined that his story would touch so many lives. As he approached the microphone, he took a deep breath. He looked at the young university students before him and smiled. "For many years, I walked into classrooms believing that my job was simply to teach. But over time, I realized that my mission was far greater. I wasn't just teaching subjects, I was shaping futures." The crowd fell into absolute silence, absorbing every word. When a student named Ethan Parker was on the verge of giving up on his dream, I simply did what any teacher should do. I believed in him. I helped him without expecting anything in return. What I didn't know was that, years later, he would do the same for me. Some in the audience were visibly moved. The story was alive in that room, unfolding right before their eyes. Life is a cycle. What we give to the world eventually finds its way back to us, Carter continued. Today, I see clearly that an act of kindness never dies. It spreads, it multiplies, and it reaches lives we never even imagined. He paused and looked at Ethan, sitting in the front row. The entrepreneur's eyes shone with pride. I made a promise to Ethan that day, that he should pay it forward when he had the chance. And he fulfilled that promise in a way I could never have foreseen. Carter smiled, and this time he made a request to the audience. Now I extend that promise to all of you. If someone ever believes in you, helps you in some way, do the same for someone else. Never let the cycle of gratitude end. The auditorium erupted in applause, and Carter felt something profound within him. He had never been alone. His legacy would continue, not just in the students he had taught, but in the countless lives they would touch in the future. That night, as he walked home, Carter looked up at the starry sky and smiled. A teacher's mission never truly ends, and the cycle of gratitude never comes to an end.